Hello and welcome to my first ever vintage watch video. What I have here today is a Bulova 23 jewel self-winding mechanical watch, and as you can see it is in fact running, which is a little bit shocking because it is manufactured in 1955. It's a pretty good looking watch for a watch of that age. It's suffering a little bit of cosmetic damage here. The bracelet does have, of course, broken links. But honestly, it looks great and it's running. It's got beautiful stainless steel back and a 10 karat gold rolled gold exterior. It claims to be waterproof, of course true at the time, but not so much anymore. Underneath the serial number is L5, which is the marking which means it's from 1955. Bulova was an American company founded in 1875 in Queens, New York. But it was a watch company that really came to the fore in the 20s through to the mid-80s. The internal mechanisms were usually manufactured in Switzerland, so they had that Swiss quality that everyone was always looking for. But as an American company, they could also market to a unique group of people that many other watch companies couldn't market to. As you can see, this one does have some damage. The stem and crown will not come out, so the time cannot be set, which is one of the reasons I was able to pick this up for relatively cheap. Won't turn, won't set the time. That will be one of the major concerns. There are also some big problems, of course, with the crystal. It's quite scratched and some cracks. A lot of dirt and detritus gummed up on the exterior. But at the end of the day, this is mostly cosmetic. If the watch is running, I'm happy to take a look at what's going on outside of it, but it's looking pretty good to me. So, this is a 1955 vintage watch. Let's take a look at what's going on inside. Alright, so step one, off with the bracelet. Not sure what I'm going to do with this once it's all said and done, whether or not I'm going to solder and clean it, sort of try and keep it original 100%, or replace it with something a little bit more modern, maybe a black leather strap. It looks pretty handsome in black leather, I would assume. That's my expectation. But first and foremost, we need to get these spring bars off. And there's the first one. And there is number two. Now it's time to try and get this back off. I've got here this JAXA wrench tool, which has little tips that fit into the grooves. It took me quite a bit of time to try and get this off, and as we get it off, we notice, yep, that's what I think watchmakers sort of call DNA. There's quite a bit of stuff coming off of the watch. Dust. I think it's more than dust, to be honest. Yeah. Nice. Who knows how many years that's been. Alright, let's actually get this bad boy open. Why did I even bother cleaning the tabletop? Well, look at that. Looks pretty much pristine in here. The rotor isn't caught up, so it's lubricated well still. It's running well. No obvious markings. Pretty good. Well, time to try and get this stem off, which again took quite a bit of time. Nothing was working until I decided to try and unscrew it, which, thankfully, worked out. Crown's off, but now what? So thankfully with the crown off, the rest of the whole assembly, including the shock absorbing housing and the gasket, could actually all come out at once. I was pretty worried this wasn't going to happen. In some of the other watches I've worked on, and if you can't get the stem out, the rest of it won't come out at all. But thankfully, this was not the case for this watch. Now that it's removed, we can take a closer look at the case of the watch and the crystal. And without the dial to distract us, it is not looking too good. It's definitely seen better days. That looks like a pretty deep gouge there at the top. I'm not sure if we'll be able to actually buff that out in any way, but we'll see. That's for later. With all the rust that actually ended up being in the stem, that was the reason it couldn't actually turn whatsoever, I'm putting in some 3-in-1 rust penetrating oil, trying to see what we can do to actually free that up. While we wait for that oil to work on the rust, it's time to actually take a screwdriver to this thing. And the first thing that will come off is the automatic winding rotor. This, in this case, is only held on by a clip. It is not actually held on by a screw directly. So once I unscrew that tiny screw there, we're just going to flip it all over. And after just a little bit of finesse, there it is. I should mention, of course, that this being a disassembly, I'm not wearing any finger cots to prevent my finger oils and whatnot from getting onto the watch. All of these parts will be given a thorough cleaning very soon, but once I begin the reassembly, we will, of course, be wearing all the appropriate latex finger cots to prevent oils. So now it's time to remove the hands of the watch. We're going to protect the dial with a piece of plastic, and we're going to use a Presto hand tool to remove the hands. Just as I say, presto. Having not actually worked on this watch before, I wasn't expecting the shock-absorbing housing to just come off like that, but it just did. So now that there's nothing else in the way, it's time to remove the dial of the watch itself. And those two screws are going to be on the side of the watch, recessed, being very careful not to undo them all the way or else they will fall out. But once those are unscrewed, the dial should just come free pretty easily. Now that the dial has come off, I pretty quickly realized that the 3-in-1 rust-penetrating oil that I've been putting on has actually accumulated on the underside of the dial, as well as the actual front of the watch movement as well. That will require quite a bit of cleanup, but thankfully that's the reason we're here. Time to remove the dial washer and the hour wheel. And now it's on to the upper bridge for the automatic device. That one was a little bit longer than the rest of them. Better remember that. Now it's time to remove the upper bridge for the automatic device. And once we take that off, we reveal all the gears that actually take the spinning movement of that automatic rotor and actually translate that into the force that will actually wind the watch. Here I'm removing the two alternating gears, which is what they're called because they both make contact with the oscillating weight gear, and depending on which way the weight is turning, one of them will engage the reduction gear, and then from there wind the actual mainspring. It's a pretty unique mechanism. What we don't see is that underneath each of those gears was an additional gear that actually, depending on which way it moves, one of them will slip and one of them will engage. Next to be removed is the tension spring. This little V-shaped spring actually pushes upwards on the underside of those two alternating gears that I first took off. This is what allows one of the gears to actually slip, while it's not the one that's supposed to be rotating given the direction of the automatic rotor. Now it's just time to remove the remainder of the automatic winding mechanism, which at this point is only the lower bridge and rotor arbor. Once this is removed, what remains is essentially a manual winding watch without the automatic mechanism. Now that the rest of the watch has been exposed, the next step should be to remove the power from the mainspring. The way this is supposed to be done is that after rotating the mainspring slightly, I should be able to disengage the click, which is the mechanism that holds the mainspring in place, and the mainspring should actually unwind itself under its own tension. However, in this case, every time I tried to do that, it wouldn't unwind. I actually didn't have an idea as to why that would be the case just yet. We'll figure that out later. At this point, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not supposed to remove certain parts if the mainspring power is still on, so I didn't recognize this screw, so I decided just to give it a shot and see what happened. Well, nothing flew away. And again, I didn't recognize what was happening in this watch. In the previous watches I'd worked on, the seconds hand and the seconds pinion that's attached to it was all part of one big gear. But in this case, the seconds pinion was its own separate piece, separate from the seconds wheel. This was not what I was expecting at all. Well, at this point, we're still stuck, unable to undo the power on the mainspring. So I decided maybe it's the stem that's the problem. And lo and behold, the 3-in-1 oil has worked its magic. We can actually remove the rusted-in stem. And it is certainly quite rusty. Now that the stem is out of the way, I am hoping that that is the final obstacle to undoing the power on the mainspring. Once again, disengaging the click, and there we go. Unwinding. Thank goodness. We know it's fully powered down when the balance wheel stops spinning. Now it's time to remove that balance wheel. This is the part of the watch that functions much like the pendulum would on a grandfather clock. It swings back and forth and it allows the spring to release its power one little click at a time. This is one of the most delicate parts in the entire watch. The balance has one thing called the hairspring, which is a very, very thin and very, very delicate spring. As you can see there, slowly and slightly unwinding. And I have to be very, very careful not to damage that, nor the tiny pivot that sits on the very bottom of this wheel that allows it to swing back and forth. I believe the size of these things is in the tenths of millimeters. So any amount of damage to these, any amount of jostle, it's game over for this watch. Now it's time to undo the ratchet wheel. This is the wheel that, when turned, will actually wind up the mainspring. This particular screw is normally threaded and will look very similar to the wheel and the screw right next to it, which is called the crown wheel. One thing to keep in mind is that the crown wheel, being the wheel that spins in the opposite direction to the ratchet wheel, it has the opposite thread. So in this case, it is threaded in an unconventional direction. Some older screws will actually have a few extra grooves on it to mark it as the opposite threaded screw, but this one, they just expect you to know that, I guess. In a manual wind watch, this crown wheel is in fact turned by the crown. But in an automatic watch, it is engaged by both the crown and the automatic winding mechanism. Now it's time to remove the barrel bridge, the component of the watch that holds the mainspring and its housing, known as the barrel, in place. Now the mainspring barrel can come out. This particular barrel says, "Do not open, sealed for life." Now I'm not sure whether or not that's true, but for now, I'm not going to touch it. On to the pallet cock. This is the part of the watch that holds the tiny little trident-shaped fork called the pallet in place. The pallet fork is what makes the familiar ticking sound that we hear in all mechanical wristwatches. This fork moves back and forth, engaged by the pendulum of the balance wheel, And as it moves, it releases the energy from that main spring through all these other wheels that we can see, one tick at a time. And there is the pallet fork. On to the upper bridge of the rest of the mechanism. As you can see, I was having quite a bit of trouble removing this bridge. What I didn't realize was that the wheel we can see on the very top, which is the second wheel, is not as simple as it may appear. I had never experienced this before, but what is happening is that the second wheel is in fact connected to an additional wheel, much like a sandwich on either side of the bridge. The bottom wheel engages with the third wheel, seemingly, on this watch mechanism, and the top is engaged with the second's pinion, that very delicate needle-like object that we removed from the center of the watch earlier. With that bridge out of the way, we can remove the third wheel and the escape wheel. Also, the winding pinion and the clutch wheel, which are normally connected to the stem, can come out. And now it's on to the dial side of the movement. This side contains what is known as the keyless works, the components that allow for the setting of the time and the manual winding of the watch, as well as some of the actual things that turn the hands of the watch itself. First of all, we're going to remove the setting lever spring. I undid the screw partially, allowing me to undo the tension of that little arm on the setting lever itself. If I just unscrewed this all the way, there's a potential of things flying all over the place. Now it is time for the yoke spring, which is probably the hardest part of the watch disassembly for me personally. I struggle with this because it tends to fly away, and I've yet to figure out a foolproof method to make sure it never does that. But thankfully, this time, I think it worked okay. I was about to remove the yoke when I realized this yoke is incredibly straight. It is going to be hard to determine which direction it's supposed to face. Many of the other yokes I've seen have a much more discernible shape to them. Makes it a little bit easier to figure out. Now for the setting wheel, and then the minute wheel, leaving just about nothing on the watch itself. The cannon pinion proved to be a slight struggle. And last but not least, the setting lever, which is attached by this setting lever screw, which is actually on the opposite side of the main plate. And there it is, the naked main plate. Mechanical watches of this era were supposed to be serviced once every 2 to 3 years, much like an oil change on a car. When a watchmaker finished their service, they would inscribe the inside of the backplate with their initials and the year that the service was performed. On the inside of this watch's backplate, there's only one inscription from 1958, 3 years after the manufacture of this watch. Given there are no other inscriptions, and the generous quantity of DNA gummed up on the exterior of the watch, we can probably assume that this was in fact the only service ever performed. If that is the case, the fact that this watch was still running after an additional 62 years is truly stunning. And here's the watch, fully disassembled, ready for cleaning. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time when we reassemble this lovely watch.